We have people trickling in. Just a couple more minutes and we will start this as soon as we have a critical mass of people. I think we're up to 62 participants. Just one more minute. And Brad, you're going to be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, yes?
Yes, I will monitor the chat and the Q&A.
Thank you. Just one more minute. I think we have about 71 people join us. I think we can start now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar hosted by the Research Capacity and Development Committee, which is a part of the Society for Social Work Research. In case people didn't know, the Research Capacity Development Committee was created in 2017 to build research capacity across the career lifespan of social work scholars. My name is Anamika Barmanadhikari. I am an associate professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver and have been a member of RCDC since 2019. And I'll be moderating today's conversation along with Dr. Brad Lynn, who is a visiting assistant professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Buffalo, and also a member of this committee. Before we start, I wanted to make sure I thank the folks who made this webinar possible. First of all, the entire RCDC committee who initiated conversation around this topic last year and actively encouraged and supported this effort to hold this conversation. Dr. Arti Maliku, who is an assistant professor at Ohio State University, who led the marketing of this event and set up the technology, without which the webinar would not be possible. And of course, Dr. Brad Lynn, my co-convener for this webinar. Before we introduce our panelists and start with our conversation, a little context on our topic, what our agenda looks like today, and some housekeeping items. Most of us recognize that combating systemic racism is one of the most pressing issues confronting our society today. The tragic deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and recently the Buffalo shootings reflect how structural racism is deeply rooted in American society. And systemic racism affects about every aspect of life in the United States, including our colleges and universities. Higher education institutions have an important ethical responsibility to support anti-racist pedagogy and scholarship, and to reform institutional policies and practices to root out systemic racism within our institution. One way of doing that is to better support anti-racist research and researchers. However, many structural barriers remain, and the purpose of today's webinar is to dig deeper into some of these institutional barriers as a way to understanding how our institutional systems and policies can be reshaped to better support such research. We purposefully structured this webinar to be more conversational and informal in order to move away from theoretical discourses to one that is practical and actionable. Our goal for this roundtable is to specifically generate concrete steps and recommendations that can eliminate some potential pathways forward and inspire collective efforts to advance anti-racist research. Additionally, because we wanted to focus on the systemic aspects of conducting anti-racist research, we invited both scholars who conduct this kind of research and administrators who are frequently in a position to significantly change the structures that can support such research. And we're thrilled to have a fantastic lineup of panelists. Before I introduce our panel, I want to note that you might have noted that our panel is smaller than usual. It's because we had a couple more panelists who had to cancel just before we were about to promote this webinar. And having rescheduled this webinar a couple of times, we did not want to delay this conversation any further. And we decided to hold this important conversation in the hopes that we could continue, this could spur further conversation, and we could continue this conversation with more key stakeholders in the future. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. Our panelists today are Dr. Jack Munnell. Dr. Jack Munnell is the Faculty Senate Chair and Associate Professor of Justice Studies at Winston-Salem State University. He has over 28 years of working in the fields of social work, criminal justice, and human services. His research interests focus on Afro-Latino youth and their families, Black masculinity, pop culture, and delinquency paradigm shifts. He has published extensively exploring Black masculinity, violent police and citizen encounters, and popular culture's misrepresentation of the Black community in music, film, and print media. On a national level, Dr. Munnell serves as a consultant for local, state, and federal agencies. He's a member of the American Society of Criminology, Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the North Carolina Criminal Justice Association. Welcome, Dr. Munnell. Our next panelist is Dr. Jennifer Bellamy. Dr. Bellamy is the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and Professor at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. Dr. Bellamy's current research interests include the engagement of fathers in child and family services, child welfare and evidence-based practice. She has published extensively in the area of evidence-based social work practice and is currently engaged in the development and testing of interventions to better serve fathers in child and family programs, including home visiting and child welfare services. Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Bellamy. Our last panelist is Dr. Alan Detloff. Dr. Alan Detloff is Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work and the inaugural Maconda Brown O'Connor Endowed Dean Chair at the University of Houston. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Detloff worked in the child welfare system as a caseworker and an administrator. Dr. Detloff's work focuses on addressing and eliminating the impacts of structural and institutional racism on Black children and other children of color impacted by child welfare system intervention. He's co-founder of the Append movement, a collaborative movement that seeks to end the forcible separation of children from their parents through abolition of foster care and the child welfare system. Thank you, Dr. Detloff, for joining us today. In regards to our agenda today, we are hoping that we will be spending the first 35-40 minutes as moderators asking questions of our panelists, and the audience Q&A will be come right after that moderated conversation. And Dr. Brad Lynn will be handling the audience Q&A. For the audience Q&A, we would encourage everyone to use the Q&A feature. We'll be monitoring both the chat feature and the Q&A, but the Q&A is the one which we would encourage you to use for any questions to our panelists. Please feel free to use the chat function to interact with each other or to keep the conversation going. So without further ado, a warm welcome again to all our panelists. And I'll get started with the first question. To get the conversation going, we wanted to begin with a broader question, about anti-racist research, but one that is foundational to this issue. Many people talk about anti-racist research, and there's a lot of interest in anti-racist research, but it is often not well defined. What does anti-racist research mean to you, and how do you define it? Can we start with you, Dr. Munnell?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, I would have to start it off. So I begin everything with this quote because I think foundationally it provides context. So the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one becomes conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated by, of course, the late, great James Baldwin. Who his teachings have really shaped kind of how I look at the world, per se. When we talk about anti-racism or anti-racist research, I particularly consider myself a scholarly practitioner, which in turn means that in conducting the various studies and gathering the information to provide information to the broader community, that I'm actually engaged in the activism that we oftentimes witness in our society. So for me, anti-racist research for me, it's like criminology. It's the scientific application of what we're witnessing, not only today, because that's the popular misconception, that historically speaking, we've been dealing with this since the founding of this country in one way or another. So what we're witnessing today is popular culture's ability to amplify this in varying formats. So for me, it's critical, it's mission critical that as scholars, as researchers, that we embed ourselves into the activities that we are studying and trying to explain in layman terms to the public, to legislators, to educational institutions, and to partners. So for me, that's critical. Oftentimes, depending on whom you ask, researchers aren't deeply rooted in the studies they are engaged in for varying reasons, But I think for this particular topic, it's incredibly vital from what we've seen, particularly these last 2 to 5 years. We as scholars have an obligation in research, an obligation to our community collectively to be actively engaged in the scientific application of this area and to avoid the rhetoric that we oftentimes witness. And that's where I would define it, removing the rhetoric and the punchlines and the Monday morning quarterbacking, and to apply it with empirical based research and activism that's quantifiable and easily digestible by the layperson.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Bellamy or Dr. Detloff? Go ahead.
Hi, Jen. You want me to go? Okay. So thanks. First, just huge thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel today. I've often heard anti-racist research as being described as research that leads to more equitable outcomes, but I've started to become more and more uncomfortable with the concept of equity. And I think that we as social workers, when we think about what anti-racist research is, need to be thinking about that. And for example, social workers are often involved in doing research in systems that cause harm, systems like policing, prisons, the child welfare system, or what I call the family policing system. And when you think about it, we shouldn't want to see equity in those systems. We don't want equity in the criminal punishment system. We don't want equity in child welfare systems. What we should be striving for is elimination of those systems because of the harms they cause. So in that sense, I think of anti-racist research as research that leads to liberation from the systems that maintain the oppression of those who are currently being oppressed by the systems that social workers work in. Then in the other programs that we're involved in, we may not always desire equity because we have to acknowledge that people aren't starting from equitable places. So anti-racist research may be research that leads to the inequitable distribution of resources so that those who start with fewer resources get more. So the end goal there is equity, but to achieve equity, we need to be inequitable. And then at a bigger picture sense, then I think that really anti-racist research needs to be research that is looking at how inequity persists in society and the reality that inequity is always going to exist as long as capitalism exists in our society, and what we should be doing as researchers to be moving towards the end of that. And then lastly, I'd said that anti-racist research starts with anti-racist program development. We need to be sure as social workers that the programs, the services that we're creating are designed with an anti-racist lens before researchers start to do research on them. Because many of the programs and services that social workers are engaged in operate from a deficit lens that views families and communities as being deficient in something, and then the service is designed to improve some kind of condition within those families and communities. But if you look closely, what those services are doing is really just trying to make those families and communities more like white people. So we need, before we even get to the research part, we need to ensure that our programs and the services that we're providing are driven with an anti-racist lens that acknowledges the strengths in families and communities, and not just trying to make those families and communities more like white families and communities.
Thank you so much. It seems like both of you touched on a paradigm shift in the way we approach research and systems. Dr. Bellamy.
Yeah, I echo and agree heartily with the points my colleagues have made, and want to layer in a couple of other reflections on what anti-racist research is or could be moving forward. One thing that I've really taken to heart in my own learning is that it does take an active investment, right? It's not enough just to say I'm not being racist. And Ibram Kendi and many others have underscored that point, but I've really tried to take that to heart, in that all of us as social work researchers should be anti-racist researchers, right? So how do we center anti-racist research practices in our work? You gave us these very nice introductions. None of us necessarily had that phrase strung together. And yet I know I cannot do father work and not do anti-racist research, right? Those have to come together. The other piece that I have been thinking a lot about is that it needs to be structural in nature. There's a really cool quote, and I'm totally gonna mess it up, but the Institute for Healthcare Improvement often says, systems are structured perfectly to get the outcomes that they achieve, right? So if our structures of academia, if our structures of service and programs are getting inequitable, harmful outcomes, it's because those systems are reproducing those outcomes, and we've got to take a hard look, not just at the programs that we're studying, but also ourselves and our own processes in academia, and how those are actively causing harm and also holding back the good progress that we could be making.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your thoughtful insights. From it seems like the consensus is that anti-racist research, as Dr. Ibram Kendi said, it suggests that we need to change the lens as scholars and researchers from the individual to one of systems and policies. And instead of asking the question, what is wrong with people, we should ask the question, what is wrong with our policies and our systems, and how do we go about changing and disrupting those systems, which is a perfect segue to our next question, because it's about systems, it's about institutional systems, and what is the best way that our institutions can support anti-racist research and people who engage in that kind of work. So if we are to increase, one of the things that people have suggested that if we are to increase anti-racist research, we need new scholars who are trained to engage in this type of research? What training or supports do you think are needed to invest in the next generation of anti-racist scholars, especially at an institutional level? Whoever wants to take this question first. Go ahead, Dr. Munnell.
Definitely a loaded question there. So, no, jokes aside, I would argue that clearly would vary from institution to institution and kind of the demographics of that particular institution. But to your earlier point about kind of structural shifts collectively, and this common phrase that we oftentimes hear now about allyship and things of that nature, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. I don't need allies, I need activists. I need you to put, to be engaged more so than lip service. So institutionally, what you need is to ensure that your curriculums, as we're training new scholars, albeit in social work, sociology, criminology, whatever, discipline, you have to ensure that these curriculums are reflective of the varying trends that we're seeing in our society. Case in point, I'm in an interdisciplinary department for undergraduates. And oftentimes, we have historians, we have criminologists, we have political scientists, and we have all these individuals intersected to address the problems we see in our society. And for me, particularly, who teaches social justice and a social justice professor, it's mission critical to ensure that we're covering the areas and we're training kind of these younger scholars to be prepared to address those issues. That's theoretical foundationals, and we look at some of the literature. Some of the counter to that, and what we're seeing is that you have varying states fighting against that. And that's the man versus the machine. As social workers, which we're not unique to a fight, right? We like to fight. And I'm a pretty good boxer and counterpuncher myself. But we're in some states, I'm in North Carolina, it's not as bad as maybe my colleague in Georgia. I have a colleague in Georgia who's fighting a pretty tough system now in the state system. We have, governing bodies who, anytime you use any type of verbiage as it relates to anti-racism or racism or inequities, to use Dr. Detloff's point, they fight back. And the one thing they did in my state, which is problematic, that they removed a lot of our institutes. So any of our institutes that address, income inequality or poverty issues or food, they removed it. So we're fighting against that. So for me, it's structural in nature, understanding the state you reside in and what system. I'm a state school, some are private, those vary from private to public. But it's important to ensure that if we're training the next group of scholars, that they're receiving the information, the up-to-date theoretical, practical information to be practitioners and advocates for the public.
I'll add there because my thoughts are similar. I think this has a lot to do with our curriculum and our PhD programs, and we need radical change in our PhD programs, the way that we're training new researchers. Particularly, we need more people and more programs, leaders, students, pushing back against the idea of what is evidence and how we come to know things. Right now, if you're familiar with some of the conversations happening in the child welfare field, there's a huge discourse happening about how we know certain things and what we should be holding up as the best available evidence. And for many people, mostly white people, the best available evidence is research that comes from, or evidence that comes from, large national data sets, RCTs and things like that. And they push back against the idea of any kind of evidence that isn't nationally representative. As you heard in the introduction, I'm an abolitionist. I'm working towards abolition of the child welfare system. That movement has largely activated a small group of mostly white researchers who have said abolition isn't evidence-based, and have found research articles to try to prove that the child welfare system isn't racist and is actually good for Black children. And we'll even say, you know, studies have shown that most children who spend time in foster care actually have appreciated their experience, which is just ridiculous. But the idea of how activated this group of white people has become when we're talking about the system being racist shows you how much change we need to do in our programs. Because when, as a researcher, when you talk to a Black mother and that Black mother tells you that the system is racist, that's evidence. And that's what we need to be teaching our students about, that there are many ways to know something. And in fact, the idea, if you really say that you believe in critical race theory, we don't have to prove that these systems are racist. Racism is ordinary every day. These systems were built on a foundation of racism. So when I hear PhD students say that they're getting articles from journal reviewers that are talking about a system being racist, and a reviewer will say, you need to cite that, those are the kind of mindsets that we need to change. And that starts with radical change in our PhD programs by really thinking differently about how we know what we know. Any PhD program that has a required quantitative course that doesn't have a required qualitative course is not an anti-racist program. And that even goes back to earlier, the way that we're training social work practitioners. Any social work program that has a master's program that has a required DSM course is not an anti-racist social work program. We need to really be rethinking the way that we're teaching social work researchers, practitioners, before they even get to the point of being PhD students.
I'll build on that and say, you know, an interesting, I think I might be going on a bit of a tangent, but y'all are getting me excited about ideas and possibilities. But an interesting phenomenon I have observed as a card-carrying evidence-based practice person for a long time is that that training in a particular way of knowing has been so repeated and amplified in systems of training that I've had to do my own personal unworking of that, and then move toward, okay, how could things look differently? So I teach the master's evidence-based practice class, and instead of trying to convince everyone that the RCT is the only way of knowing whether something works, opening up that conversation to be critical of what evidence-based practice has done, hasn't done, got wrong. Even though, you know, I can build a career in an area and then have a moment of reflection to say, oh my gosh, I have missed a whole lot because of these Eurocentric, white supremacist elements that were baked into my training, and then to rethink, like my colleagues are saying, what's a radical departure from that? So how can we, yes, let's teach quantitative methods. But what really irks me is when people say, well, that's subjective, and that the issues of race and power and oppression don't come into quantitative work. It is what it is, it's math. I call baloney on that one. I think that is completely foolish. So we're not, I'll speak for myself. I'm not saying let's not teach regression. I'm saying let's put quantitative work, you know, in a proper, larger viewpoint around ways of knowing, like my colleagues are saying, and also be really critical about how those data have been used to hurt people, have been used as a place of authority, as oppression, as misleading. It's not, you know, the fallacy of well, quantitative work is objective. You know, I've really come to a clear place of questioning that. And that can feel scary to people who have built their careers on these belief systems, and that's what they've known. And I can empathize with that, but that's not a reason to stand still. And I'm excited that we're starting to have these conversations with each other. But yeah, we got a lot of work to do, and it is both, I think, personal
Mhm.
and structural.
Mhm. Thank you so much. It seems like the common thread here is we really need to radically rework what we teach our students, how our institutions change in response to that. And there is some momentum in social work departments for sure to change that culture and to nurture this new way of knowing and understanding how we support scholars to better do that. Would the academy in general be responsive to that, though? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, as Dr. Bellamy alluded to, I think change scares people to the extent that their ability to rationalize gets thrown out the window. I mean, to be quite blunt. For context, I'm at a historically Black college and university, so for the audience, so they understand the environment I come from. So oftentimes, institutionally, we've always been on the lower end of any system state-wise, as far as funding goes, as far as support oftentimes. So we've always had to fight against the machine to address what we historically have been founded for, to provide opportunities for African-Americans, to be educated, because other white institutions at that time didn't want us there. So historically, we've always fought against it. And our curriculums have been deeply rooted in addressing social injustices, since the turn of the last century. So for me, I think what you see, I mean, it's quite obvious if you just turn on the tube, right? You turn on the telly and you see, half of the country, against what they determine as wokeness, which I don't like that term either. But the point of the matter is advocacy, activism, particularly social workers, have been at the forefront. I mean, look, I'm split. So I've done a lot of my work in criminal justice. I've done a lot of my work in child welfare and family preservation and things of that nature early in my career. So for me, what you find is these systems are oppressive. In my social injustice course, that's what we call it social injustice, because the reality of it is, if you aren't a male, Eurocentric male, white male in our society who legislate for everything, the reality of it is it doesn't benefit. If you're a woman, if you're a minority, if you're religiously, we see this religious push now to ostracize other denominations. We have a lot of work to do, and people are resistant because they're fearful that for whatever reason, this country is not, they have this perception that this country is not as diverse as they want it to be. And the reality of it is we are a melting pot. Embrace it, or as they often tell us, maybe you should go somewhere where you feel more inclusive. And I can't say it any nicer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, there is definitely a lot of fear mongering involved, as and especially with politics, this becoming a hot button political issue, especially with critical race theory being in the news, and a lot of people pushing back against the idea, and really misleading information being spread about what it is. I think it's not a surprise that a lot of people don't support these efforts. But Dr. Detloff and Dr. Bellamy, do you have anything?
I was just going to add that it's important to acknowledge that it's not just systems and institutions that are pushing back on this. Mm-hmm. It's historically well-respected social work researchers that are mm-hmm. pushing back against this kind of change. And so we need to acknowledge that that this is happening within us. We're fighting against each other right now for this, to bring about this change.
Thank you.
Yeah, I got so into what my colleagues were saying, I forgot the prompt.
Well, there's more momentum in social work about, supporting basic research with other disciplines who have, similar interest, would be responsive to that.
Yeah, I have been looking a lot at my colleagues working in different areas and how they're articulating the specifics how we get movement to happen and getting us beyond the statements, right? Every journal and every school has the statement about how they support anti-racist, anti-oppressive practices, but so does like Burger King. So we can do better than that. But I'm trying to learn from my colleagues in other fields as well, because there's a really cool piece from a feminist scholar, Shiva Sabati. I had a note about her name, who, this was really fascinating to me because I'm currently the chair of the IRB for the University of Denver. And this is a feminist scholar. And what this person did was really articulate what would anti-racism look like carried out in the context of human subjects, ethics, IRB boards. And it was like mind blown. I do that work every day, but thinking about, the places where we do have opportunities to learn from other fields and colleagues, and then also to lead. So social work isn't alone in this fight. And then we're also ahead in some ways. So we've got to, I think, both be humble and open to learning from our colleagues in feminist studies and African American studies and in indigenous studies. And I've seen sociologists putting great work, that we have a lot to learn from each other. And then we are also need to push each other and lead. And some people are going to fight. But like we said earlier, we're up for it.
Thank you. Kind of shifting gears a bit, a lot of you spoke of many of the barriers people experience in doing this kind of research, and all three of you have administrative roles. So you have, some power to change things in your own institutions, in your own departments. So what are the things that you can do, or other departments, institutions can do to bring some of these barriers down? If you have implemented any efforts, any initiatives yourself that you could speak about, that we could take to other institutions can use as an example, I think that would really help this conversation.
I guess I'll go real quick. I was waiting. I'm looking at Alan and Jennifer. Okay, I want to go now. So, one area in particular that has been big, and I know my colleagues can relate, is this whole DEI push. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, a popular kind of misnomer of sorts is that because I'm at an HBCU that we don't have DEI issues. And that's far from the truth. So me particularly in my executive team, have been working with our leadership, not only on the system level. So I represent our school on the system level, and then of course at the institution. And we've been working on addressing kind of DEI initiatives at our school to ensure that all of our faculty, our staff, and of course our student body are appropriately reflected and supported at our particular institution. Because the reality of it is, you have a diverse group of individuals, but sometimes some of the other areas get overlooked. Acknowledgement of various faiths, acknowledgement of various cultures, and things of that nature. And for context too, I'm a native New Yorker, so I'm so used to diversity. So I live in the South, that's a whole other story. But I'm a Yankee, and I love diversity. So that's really been one of my pushes. Like, we need to amplify. What month is this again? Okay, how many faculty or staff do we have that represent this? Make sure we program. Now, COVID has really impacted that, obviously, these last 2 years. So it is the hope to get that back. But there has been areas at my institution where we worked on ensuring that all faiths are appreciated, all gender equality is represented, and things of that nature. And once again, it's been an interesting ride so far. But even on a system level, at the UNC system level, we have incredible DEI problems. and I'll reserve my comments probably till later, but on a system level, we're working on, obviously it was a national story, we're working on addressing what's happening in our system, because as you can tell from the news and other places, we need to do a better job systemically.
Thank you. Thank you for your efforts.
I think one of the things that we haven't touched on yet relates to tenure expectations and within schools of social work, which we do have a lot of control over within our schools. So I think one thing, practical thing, is schools of social work significantly revising their tenure and promotion expectations. So the focus is on the impact that our work has on the people and the populations that we're working with, so that the focus is on impact in terms of policy changes, practice changes that are making an actual difference in people's lives, not on the current system, which is the emphasis on artificial measures like quantity of publications, amount of research dollars, or even the ridiculous concept of impact factors of journals, which has nothing to do with actual impact. How many other researchers, how many other of us read and cite our papers? That's not impact. So fundamentally changing the concept of the way that we think about tenure and promotion is one of them. Another practical thing that we can do is start to push back, think differently about the gatekeeping that happens within journal publishing, both because of paywalls and how the review process works. First, anti-racist researchers should be publishing in open access journals because there is nothing anti-racist about a paywall. But we're not publishing in those journals because those journals don't have impact factors, because open access journals fundamentally reject the concept of impact factors as being elitist. But we're trained and told that we have to be publishing in these journals that have impact factors, when again, that has nothing to do with actual impact. So I think those of us who are in leadership roles need to be saying to our faculty, even despite them being told this for years, I actually did say this to my faculty and it didn't go over very well, but I said I could care less about impact factors. That didn't go over very well, but I probably should have messaged it better. But the idea is that that's not what's important. That's not what's important. The outcomes that our work is producing is important. A $10,000 grant that leads to significant policy change within an agency that betters something for the population you're working with is worth more than $1 million grant, NIH grant, that doesn't lead to any outcome. If a researcher writes one paper about a pilot study of universal basic income, and that leads Congress to passing universal basic income, that one article is better than 30 other articles published in high impact journals. So we just have to fundamentally rethink the way that we think about what's creating impact, and then address the gatekeeping that happens in journal publishing, which leads to how we know what we know.
Yeah, thank you so much for touching on that, because I think one of the issues that a number of institutions experience is that they do hire faculty who engage in anti-racist research, but then have a hard time retaining them if they don't change their promotion and tenure criteria, which often have very traditional ways of assessing impact. So I'm really, thank you so much for those thoughtful suggestions, because I think it provides a clear roadmap for what institutions and departments can do to change some of those standards and better retain faculty who engage in work that has significant public impact and might not be captured by these traditional metrics. So thank you for that. Dr. Bellamy?
I'm just gonna keep building on that story there and say yes, absolutely. And actually, Anamika and I'll just out us. Promotion and tenure committee together at the University of Denver, and are working on this very issue. We sort of pressed pause to say, okay, we see the problems in the places where we have control. I think we can make some real changes. One of the conversations that came up in that process, though, was, we have this external reviewer system. Mm-hmm. And so while our faculty, we'll try to learn from your experience and try to do, good messaging and bring our colleagues along with us. But we still have this larger system, right? So there's a fear. Yes, let's say our promotion and tenure framework radically changes, and we do that work, and I'm super excited about it. And then there's a fear that our external reviewers may not. And so I think there's a place for a larger field-wide conversation about this and efforts to put models out there and messaging and supports, because it's not just at the local, but we also, open ourselves up to others to critique our work and weigh in on that process as well. And the other one I wanted to just mention, because it hasn't, a little bit with the journal issue, but those of us who are associate editors and editors of journals, how can we rethink the way that we do business? There's the issue of access that Dean Detloff was talking about, but there are other places where journals, editorial boards can have an impact on the gatekeeping, but also then what does get published in terms of are the practices of carrying out research anti-racist in nature, not just how variables are being used, but how is the community engaged in the process of research? And if that wasn't there, that should be a limitation, just as a limitation of sampling or analysis is. So, how do we shift our practices where we do have some control? So there's promotion and tenure, there's the IRB I mentioned, there's these editor and associate editor roles. So looking for those opportunities in the places where we can affect change, I start to see more and more of them.
Right. And it seems like we need to move away from talking the talk, like going back to the statements and walking the talk. In fact, I was watching one of Dr. Ibram Kendi's TED interviews, and he said, just tear away those diversity statements and put out an anti-racist statement and concrete steps as to how you would go about doing that work. And that really resonated with me. But I think I'm out of time. I see the chat blowing up, and there are already 6 questions in our audience Q&A queue. So I will, even though I had 2 more questions to get through, I'll stop here because I want to make sure the audience, gets to ask their questions. So over to you, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you, Anamika. I appreciate it. So we've had a couple of questions come through in both the chat and the Q&A, and I'd like to invite audience members to continue to put their questions in the Q&A, and we will get to just as many of them as we can. So Dr. Bellamy, I'd like to start with you for this first question. Academic policy has created a number of harms and continues to perpetuate a number of harms. Is there anything being done to mitigate racial trauma experienced by students of color in academic institutions?
I wish I could say yes, and I have amazing examples of how that's happening, but unfortunately, I don't have great examples of how trauma is being repaired and addressed, other than the stories of hope and support and gratitude that I hear from students of color are really in the more interpersonal spaces where there is that colleague that reaches out to them. And this, goes into that same conversation of the invisible labor that is shouldered unevenly by our colleagues, BIPOC colleagues, women, or our genderqueer colleagues who, by the nature of their identities, are making connections with scholars that share those identities and experiences. And those are the stories that I hear, right? There was this one person who kept me from leaving the academy or kept me from falling apart. So I'm hoping my colleagues on the panel have a better example of a program or an intervention or something better than that, but that's honestly what I have observed and heard over the years.
Dr. Munnell or Dr. Detloff?
Similar to Dr. Bellamy. So once again, I am at a historically Black college and university, which means, over 97% of our students are either African American, or we have an increasing number of Latino students growing, as well as white students, Asian students. So when we talk about this trauma, that's a very interesting topic. So I raised to, actually last semester, I raised to my provost, because we were seeing an increased number in suicides with Black males, particularly younger Black males, high school males. So, I was very concerned, as was our provost. And we tried, we set up some meetings with our health and wellness center, which is where our clinical component is on campus, to how to address this. And not just for the males, but even for our young ladies as well. The constant bombardment of deaths and racial animosity and things of that nature has been so magnified, right? And because these last 2 years, everybody's been concentrated to the phone or to the television and not outside and doing other things, it's just magnified. So they come in and they perform poorly, sadly, or whatever the case may be. So no, we don't have any specific program, but what I've been pushing is that we do have a more proactive approach to ensure that not only our upper class folks, but our freshmen coming in, that there are vehicles and entities and safe spaces where they can go. Because sadly, many of our students are either directly impacted by this trauma that the audience member presented, or they're indirectly related because of their environment they reside in. So our school is the safe space. That's the good thing, that coming to the universities is a safe space. It's just a matter of ensuring that they're successful, not just academically. I always say that's easy for me. What are we doing to ensure their holistic, entity, their entire being as well, physically, mentally, socially? Because unfortunately, we get so to Dean Detleff's point about metrics, we get so caught up on what we have to report to our governing bodies and what do we have to report, that we forget the humanistic side of our students. They're humans, man. They're not property, they're humans, and we need to ensure they're successful. And finally, faculty and staff, because I think faculty and staff get overlooked because I guess we're paid to be there. And that's something that's really been on our agenda. It's an agenda item. Faculty, I deal with the faculty welfare. Because what you're finding is faculty are just, they're leaving. They're like, listen, I'll go back to the private sector. I'll be a stay-at-home parent or whatever. So we got to do better at it.
I'll add, we're trying a couple of things that I think that are helping a little bit. We, like post summer 2020, we saw a phenomenon happening in our classrooms where students of color would share their experiences of racism, and then white students would start to cry. And then all of the attention of the classmates and the professor would go directed at the crying white student instead of the students of color who were just talking about their experiences of racism. And we realized that the trauma that was happening in the classroom for students of color. So we've created outside of the classroom spaces based on like a caucus model only for students of color, where white students can't go, to process what they're experiencing in their classrooms, microaggressions that they're experiencing, different things like that. And that's helping a little bit. The other thing that we're just started doing is we hired what we're calling a director of inclusive teaching and learning. So it's a staff member whose job, her full-time job, is to work with our faculty and teach them how to do better, teach them how to have difficult conversations in the classroom, teach them how to address a microaggression when it happens rather than just moving on to the next thing. So because we've realized that our faculty, and our faculty will acknowledge this, don't have those kinds of skills. Most of them don't, and need better training there. So those are a couple of things that we're trying right now that I think are helping a little bit.
Thank you. We appreciate the answer. Our next question is this. What role can studying and teaching inclusive social work history have in anti-racism efforts? And what does it mean for programs that do not have historical social work courses. I wonder, Dr. Munnell, would you start us off? I
will do it briefly, but I only teach one social work course at my institution, and that's forensic social work. So I'm going to defer to my colleagues who probably have more experience in that regard.
I can jump in, and I'll give a shout out to Justin Hardy, actually, who's going to be joining the faculty at Arizona State University, and has done a really amazing job of pulling forward and amplifying Black social work, historical contributions, and leading up to today. And I would say, you know, I mentioned I teach research courses. It's my responsibility as a faculty member to educate myself on that history. So if there's not a history of social work course, let me bring history to the context of research. And so that I think connects to what I was saying earlier about these things being understood in a much larger context, and time is one of those things. And so I get we don't have the luxury of having like a class on every single thing, but I think, you know, there was a moment in time in our profession where we realized, like, you can't just do the diversity course over here in social work practice and like check off the box. Oh, you took the diversity class. Now you have cultural humility, or whatever we were calling it back then. Cultural competence, I think was the term of art when I was in school. But really that there are pieces of this that need to be threaded through every single class, right? So we can't just expect one faculty member to have deep expertise in anti-racist research histories that play into these longstanding power differentials and harms and things like that. Like, we all need to do that work and be able to bring that into the classes that we do teach.
I'd add that I think that the key to that is, I agree that it has to go across courses like Jen said. I think the key though is social work for a long time has struggled with our sense of legitimacy, I guess, or how we are compared to, that we're as good as other professions. And I think that leads to some fear in what we teach. But so the key to this is acknowledging that social work has an incredibly racist history, that the entire profession was founded on an idea of white saviorism to save poor white children from poverty. We have to acknowledge that Jane Addams had racist views that we don't talk about, that we don't tell people about. So the entire profession, the child saving movement, friendly visitors, all of those things come from a white supremacist culture lens. And so, and that hasn't gone away. That persists. The entire child welfare system still operates on a white savior lens. You know, we have to acknowledge those things, that it's not just history, it's current too. There's a huge problem of racism currently in the social work profession.
Thank you, Dr. Detloff and Dr. Bellamy, Dr. Munnell too. Our next question came in when we were talking about levels of evidence and hierarchies of evidence earlier in our hour together. And so the question is this: what suggestions might you have for dismantling the hierarchy of knowledge and taking that apart? Dr. Detloff, could we start with you?
Well, I think as Jen and I both talked about, it can start at the level of tenure, the way that we think about tenure expectations. I think that really is a big part of it. And I think, you know, Jen, I've had the same conversations with my faculty about what happens at the external review place. I've always thought, I believe it to be true, that external reviewers are supposed to follow the policy of our school. So we've thought that we would put, like, really in bold letters in our invitation, your review has to follow our policy, even if you disagree with it. And then that's the same thing at the institutional level too. At the institutional review committees, they're supposed to be assessing the degree to which candidates have met what our policy says is needed for tenure. So that's not tested yet. It's not tested at my school. Jen, you're further along than we are even, but I think it really does start, part of it starts with tenure. Then another part of it starts with just, though particularly like deans and directors, associate deans, those who have some influence, pushing back on these ideas of impact factors, H indexes, and not rewarding people for those things, getting out of that mindset. I've tried to, I think communications can be part of this, the way that our communications work in our schools. I've tried to work over the years with my director of communications to say things like, if a researcher gets $1 million NIH grant, that's not a news story because nothing's happened yet. The story is the outcome of the work. And so those are ways to shift people's mentality about what we value, the measures that we value. We made a very conscious decision. We are never going to say what our ranking, our US News and World Report ranking is. It's been removed everywhere from our website, and we're never going to talk about that again. And we're not even going to participate in that system because it's ridiculous and elitist. More people need to be pushing against those kind of systems because they're just meaningless. They're artificial, and we shouldn't be upholding them.
Thank you, Dr. Detloff. Dr. Bellamy or Dr. Munnell? Okay. Nope, go ahead.
I have such like a turn-taking thing in my head. I was like, well, I talked and then, so I'm deferring to you.
Hey, at least we're having fun with this. The audience, we're having fun with this. Dr. Lynn, no, I mean, Dean Detloff, I mean, he said it quite poignantly. There's nothing else to add.
All right.
Yeah, I have one little add-on, I think. Totally agree. And I would say, as much as we're saying what not to do, I also want us to say what to do. So I love the communications example. And then it's sort of like thinking about, well, how do we describe our work? Because we've done it the other way so long. Everybody's got, their statements, and then we like share our statements, and then people use that as a model. And so we have to find new models and new mentoring and new, because then it's sort of like, well, then what? How do I demonstrate impact? And in my mind, there's like a bajillion ways to do that, right? Everything from, there's now a neighborhood where you can safely park your car in Denver and sleep overnight and not get harassed by this police and get some services, as an impact, to changing policy that Congress is laying out. So, and I find value in all of that, but it feels, we'll go back to the fear thing maybe, because we haven't been doing that. I feel for my colleagues who don't have the privilege that I do in being a full professor and having the administrative roles that I do. There's a lot of comfort and privilege that I get from that they don't have, and it's scary to know that you're going to be judged by your colleagues, and the model is changing, the rules are changing. So we got to help each other out and provide those supports to, okay, if not the impact factor, here are the alternatives, and getting really specific about those too.
Dr. Lynn, if I may.
Absolutely.
I've actually been going back and forth with one of the audience members. Dana, shout out to you. Appreciate the conversation. But one of the major elephants in the room as we talk about kind of changing is that oftentimes what we see in the academy at any institution is this semblance of classism, right? So, for tenure track faculty to non-tenure track, to visiting versus this, to the adjuncts, to whomever, to the support staff. And oftentimes early on in my career, I just never made this a big deal about me. My objective was to ensure that I'm using my scholarship and activism to make the community better, right? That's why we get, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York during the crack epidemic and housing projects. Don't talk to me about poverty unless you just got hours to really understand what we went through and endured. So for me, it's just a life mission to help people do better. My institution right now is located in nationally speaking, the fourth poorest mobility area in the country. So, you know, if we're not doing, if the institutions are not extending, are not providing their faculty and staff and students to support, to be inspirational and powerful and advocates, and then go into the community, then what are we there for? And to Dean Detloff's point about kind of the posturing and some of the stuff that we're, and Dr. Bellamy said as well, we're accustomed to doing things the old way because that's how we all were trained, you know, and some of us are a little bit more intuitive to kind of say, okay, that didn't work, we're doing it differently. But we have to change even how we treat each other on campus. On some institutions, faculty are pitted against staff, and the reality of it is, I mean, you know, what are we here for? So for me, it's that whole, you know, kind of reimagining of what the academy should look like in the 21st century. And if we're not moving in that direction, we are going to be, them schools are going to have a lot of problems moving forward.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions about sort of advice for early career folks. So those questions sort of summarized go something like this. What advice do you have for early career scholars who want to push against traditional research paradigms while still finding success in finding and keeping jobs? Maybe Dr. Detloff, would you lead us off?
I have this conversation often with PhD students, or I'm sure you do too, Jen. And I tell them, one, go to our schools, go to Denver and Houston. Find the places where you're going to be valued. That's like my first answer. But then I think, you know, it's also finding other, you know, communities of younger scholars that are going to push back against the status quo, because I've seen a huge gap, generational gap, between new PhD grads and the what the deans and the deans, which I'm endlessly frustrated with often, in terms of the movement that their direction their programs are going on and doing the kind of changes that we've been talking about today. But if there's enough new scholars pushing against those things and just literally just demanding change from their deans and directors and their senior faculty members, I think people will see that the tide is turning, and it's turning in the direction of the newer scholars.
Yeah, I agree. I you know, on the one hand, I definitely want people to find the place that values them, where they can do the work that they want to do. And then I also recognize you got to pay the rent and you got to get a job. And I'll say, I did not get a job straight out of my PhD, and it was terrifying. So I want to acknowledge that too. Like you have kids and families to support, and you invested, you know, 3 to 8 years of your life or however long in this degree. And then, you know, you want to, so I like that balance that I just heard from Alan, where it's like, look for the places where you can get the support. And if it's not a place where you feel institutionally that's the case, I have been at, I don't know, 4 or 5 different schools of social work, and I've always been able to find folks who I can hang together with and push forward. You know, if it feels like that sometimes it's you versus the institution, you know, finding the people that are your fighters along with you. I personally have found really sustaining, and through those scarier times when I thought, I don't know if academia is for me or is just going to chew me up and spit me out. So that I just want to like emphasize that all of those pressures are very real. I think sometimes it's easy to forget like that piece too. So for the early career folks out there, just want to acknowledge that.
Lori, I just saw your post. Faculty have incredible power. They just have to be reminded. Sheesh. But to the point, I like Dean Detloff's point. I use that often, good sir. Hey, go where you're appreciated. But in the event you get to an institution, and of course it's early in your career, as Dr. Bellamy stated, and you're trying to establish yourself, mentorship is key. So it is always my hope. Now, we don't have well, let me rephrase. We haven't pushed our mentorship program at our institution. It's been very individualized departmentally. My department, I was fortunate. We had a mentor, not in my discipline necessarily, but he was very supportive and guided me along the way. He still gives me great advice, almost 11, 12 years later. So mentorship is key. So I would argue, as we were oftentimes encouraged as PhD students, if your school doesn't have that kind of program, or you don't like your mentor for whatever reason, try to kind of ask around or observe who you might think might be supportive of your research, or maybe similarities and things of that nature, and ask for them to provide you that support. And then from there, they can guide you. Because oftentimes I find junior faculty members running around like chickens with their head cut off. And it's sad because they truly look like freshmen, undergrads who, they just really don't understand what's going on. So I always try to be that friendly face, that friendly ear, supportive, because my thing is, who wants to live like that? You want to enjoy where you work. I love where I work, and I want you to enjoy it too. So being supportive, finding colleagues, and they may not always be a faculty member, but finding someone who's going to support you at your respective institution and help you navigate those spaces where you maybe your research is a little bit, I hate to say radical, but radical, or whatever term they use, and they'll teach, they'll kind of give you the roadmap to navigate, because you always find those at any institution.
Thank you, Dr. Munnell. We have a question that says, what are some ways that those of us working in predominantly white spaces in the US can operationalize anti-racism when faced with high levels of resistance from both students and colleagues? Dr. Munnell, would you? So
right now, so I've taught at PWIs as well, but I'm at an HBCU now. But in my PWI time, what I found, and I responded to one of the questions, the Q&A questions, my experiences have been different. I don't know if it's my personality. I don't, I don't know if it's my charisma. I don't know. But in my white spaces, I've had a very good knack of engaging with white students and colleagues and talk about these very difficult situations or topics, and not make them feel like they didn't want to listen. So for me, it's about maybe approach. It's about engaging with colleagues. Now, you can have some folks who just don't want to hear it. That's the reality of where we're at in our society. But for me, it's been about, I'm going to speak my truth. For context, I used to work for the government many years ago and had a clearance, and you was oftentimes muzzled with what you could say, how you say it, when to say it. When I did transition into the academy full time, I felt like a butterfly, as my wife would say. I just transformed, and I was free. Because of the fact that now I could speak against what we've seen historically. So for me, I would caution that. I would defer to my colleagues who are doing it now. But for me, I didn't have bad experience. And I'll give you this final one and I'll let it go. One of my students' grandfather said one time, "Your professor's Black. Oh, he would never teach me," and said a bunch of other stuff I won't repeat here. So I was like, this young man, this kid, great kid, grew up in the mountains of Western North Carolina, goes hunting for bears, all that stuff. And he was like, I took this young man, he went to the inner city of Charlotte, taught at loved the kids loved him, just had a different outlook. At graduation, I made it my business to walk up to his granddad and shake his hand. He turned red in the face. He was so upset. I said, "Your grandson is such a special kid." And just left it like that. For me, I'm not going to let racism, not on my watch. I'm in the South, and I'm going to fight against it because I just don't believe in that. And that's my personality. Everybody's different, and everybody's approach is different. Use what's best for you. As a social justice professor, I always say, use your gifts to combat injustices, however you feel fit.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Munnell. Dr. Detloff or Dr. Bellamy? any thoughts about what to do when you encounter resistance?
It's such a tricky question because of what's come up before, in the sense that I have enormous empathy for people who need to eat and pay the bills. And I recognize that I can be very bold and radical in the things that I say, but I have enormous privilege that comes with not the dean part. I can be removed as being dean any day, but I have tenure. And, so even if I'm removed as dean, I have tenure, and then I'm a professor, and there's a minor consequence of a reduction in salary, so access to resources, but I still have tenure. So it becomes, so my answer is the same as Dr. Munnell's, to always be authentic and never be afraid to challenge the status quo and speak out against injustice every time you see it. It just comes with this enormous caveat that I know how oppressive it is to work in this system, and how fearful it is when you're in the tenure process, when you're concerned that something you're going to say, then that person's going to be on your tenure committee. And so it's that part is just really difficult, that I don't have a good answer for.
Yeah, I think my answer is very similar. And also, I haven't been tracking the chat very well, because again, I'm like laser focused on what people are saying, but I did see like the non-tenure track piece emerge, and I really appreciate that too. To your point, Alan, for those of us who enjoy the protections of tenure, that's not available to everybody. And if you're on a contract basis, that can amplify some of those fears and things like that. So I just want to appreciate that reflection, that I didn't follow it, but I saw that come up, and I was like, oh, that's a really good point to add to the conversation. And I think just building off of that thread of authenticity that I heard from both of you all, is that we're going to come at this work in a different way. One thing I've found for myself is to be non-defensive, and to use a lot of like this. Again, this is my style, right? So like, Dr. Munnell and Dr. Detloff and I, we got different styles, and that's cool. We're so for me, it's been non-defensiveness and a lot of like humility, and also exposure of things that I used to be afraid to say out loud. Like I used to be terrified of saying out loud that I didn't get a job. I went to Columbia University. I thought, oh, that's going to unlock all the doors. No. It did not. And that was incredibly humbling. And I was terrified to admit that. And now I'm saying it on a webinar, and this is recorded, and y'all going to play it again. But some of it is sharing these things in a very transparent way. And again, I recognize that is way easier from where I sit right now than it used to be. So that too, but I hope that's helpful for people to hear, like, I've screwed up. I didn't start where I didn't come out as a baby academic like this, it's a process, and I have work to do for sure. And I'm going to keep screwing up. And so I hope that like humility, transparency, authenticity piece, works. And those are some of the tools that I use.
Dr. Lynn, real quick, and Dr. Bellamy, they're giving you a lot of shout outs in the chat, by the way. I know you know. I would say this is equally as important, and it goes back to my mentorship piece. I think for junior faculty members, you do have to be very calculated in how you speak out, how you kind of push varying items. I know, like, for example, in my department, my senior faculty wouldn't let me, if I had an issue, they said, go through them. Because they were tenured at the time, let them push the agenda, you observe, take notes, and understand kind of how the nuances of the tiered system went at my particular institution. And I think that's important as senior faculty members to ensure that we don't leave our junior faculty members dangling either, that we support them, let their voices be heard, but protect them. And I think that's even more important. We want them here, so why not protect them? I always never understood that when I saw that in other departments. You would do everything to recruit these faculty, but then you leave them dangling, but that's, I don't want to get off kilter, but anyhow, there.
Thank you, Dr. Munnell. our next question asks about strategies to disempower and disrupt racist systems and those within systems. This question starts with a compliment to the panelists that says, implied in what each of you have wonderfully shared is the hard truth about who really has power and control over the systems. So could you share your thoughts or strategies about ways to disempower and disrupt racist systems? Dr. Detloff, I'm going to go to you because this makes me think about what you said a few minutes ago about demanding power and demanding change and not relinquishing that demand until power is relinquished.
Yeah, a number of things crossed my mind when you were reading this question. And the first thing that popped into my mind is that we have to acknowledge that social work as a profession is deeply embedded in harmful, oppressive systems. And there is not agreement about that in the field. Social work as a profession is complicit in violence and oppression of mostly Black people through our ongoing support, endorsement, and collaboration with the police. And until social work gets to a place where it doesn't just write a code of ethics that is largely performative, we as a profession are not going to be change makers. We literally have a code of ethics that says social workers must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. And then we go to work in the systems that are responsible for oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. And we think that's okay. The National Association of Social Workers, who writes that code of ethics, also believes that 100% of the child welfare system workforce that forcibly separates Black children from their families daily because of largely poverty, they believe that 100% of that workforce should be social workers. So we have to acknowledge that we are the oppressors. Social work is complicit in oppression in the way that we're operating, and we are not operating in line with our code of ethics. So then first, just acknowledging that and figuring out what we're going to do with that huge problem that exists within our profession right now, because I think that we're at the point of, I honestly think we're at the point of just looking ridiculous as a profession, because nothing that we say about the way that we think about justice is the way that we're actually practicing. But then I do think we need to just continue to demand that that changes and continue to speak up about it, because I think there is a generational shift. And the old guard of people who are still collaborating with the police, there's literally a social work program that's right now developing a specialization on social work practice with the police, which is just mind-blowing to me. But we have to be pushing back against all that and removing ourselves from those situations. I think until social, and that's what I really think needs to happen. A colleague of mine, Victoria Copeland, came up with a term, mass refusal, where we as social workers are just going to refuse to work in harmful, oppressive systems, notwithstanding the fact that academia is a harmful, oppressive system, but at least starting with the police, at least starting with prisons, at least starting with child welfare systems, and remove ourselves from those things and just demand that things are going to be different.
Thank you, Dr. Detloff. Dr. Bellamy or Dr. Munnell?
I had another thought emerge. It's kind of similar, as we take down structures like the way we do promotion and tenure in academia, what does the process of reimagining something different look like? And been doing some cool stuff lately that I had to work on, setting aside the evidence-based practice mindset, like let's do a literature review and then let's see what systematic reviews say the effect sizes are, that's my fallback. But processes where evidence and ways of knowing that are diverse in nature and come from a lot of different perspectives, creating spaces and structures where that can happen from the get-go of a project. So the Breakthrough Series Collaborative, which came out of healthcare, begins with a visioning process. So as much as we want to take things down, then we need visions for, well, what does it look like when we do it in a better, different way? And I'm just starting to discover some of those opportunities. And I, like I said, I'm a learner. I have a lot more learning to do, but that also I think is exciting. Like I start to get excited about the possibilities, and maybe there's something to that visioning that can help pull us forward into you know, an incrementally better place.
You know, for me, it's just, okay, yeah. For me, it's about eradication. So, you know, I've gotten to the period or to the point in my career and age that I'm unapologetic for most of what comes out of my mouth. Because my frustration, and this is to colleagues, white or black, that I encounter, because my experiences are a direct result of this oppressive nature from day one. You know, when my sons were teenagers, I had to have the talk with them, not birds and the bees, how to survive leaving the house. I've had to do role playing and how to drive and let's pull over and how do you respond to police officers. I work with our local chief and our local sheriff in programming and our city manager in programming to address how do we address this elephant. I assume an elephant, right? But this thing in the middle of the room of racism, and how do we address that? Because it's not just the academy, it's just not the criminal justice or injustice system. It's social work, which is so ironic to me when I was in graduate school, because you know, here I'm thinking, you know, social workers with us, you know, we should be the superheroes of our society. And I'm starting to read and I'm starting to see the images. And then I, you know, I go back to the Whitney Youngs and I go back to some of the individuals who are powerful in the field. You know, I went to Howard. So, you know, we did get that kind of Afrocentric Black perspective theoretically as far as the discipline. But we have to eradicate this. As social workers, all of you are empowered, whether you're in practice in the field or whether you're in the academy or whether you're in government. Government has limitations, but use your gifts. I'm a big proponent of amplifying one's voice and using that, but you have to be strategic too, right? I'm a chess player, you know, I'm unapologetic, but I'm not naive. You know, you have to be very strategic in how you approach this, because there are people, as we opened up with, there are people who don't, in communities and portions of our society, that don't want to see it happen. They don't want to see the diversity. They don't want to see, you know, poor folks uplifted. You know, they don't want to see minority community. They definitely don't want to see Black folks, uplifted. And it's so many. So we, as social workers, whether you're an administrator, for the folks in the audience, whether you're in the use your power and align yourself, you know, stay grounded in the research, use the research that's applicable to our communities. We've been conditioned. From my sociology side, I've been conditioned to follow these theorists that have nothing to do with my community. So find research, studies, colleagues who are working in your field to eradicate this racist system, period, as the young people say. Because the reality of it is just not, I know the criminal justice system gets a bad rap, and they should, but social worker, I mean, in our field, we are the ones who are supposed to eradicate that, encounter that. We've doing it here in North Carolina. I was a part of a team that worked to help free an African-American male who was wrongfully convicted for 44 years. And we had students work on this campaign in the curriculum and work on this. And that's what I'm talking about, you know, tangible results, not just rhetoric, using curriculum, using instruction and activism to really make social change, impact social change.
Thank you, Dr. Munnell. I am sorry to report that we are at 1:30 and our time together is up. I know there are a number of questions in the Q&A and in the chat that we didn't get to, but RCDC is committed to doing these kinds of webinars. So please keep an eye out for your email, or for an email for a future webinar. We use these questions that we didn't get to form an agenda and formulate questions that we will ask to future panelists. So please attend a future webinar. I have just two quick announcements to make before I say thank you. One is that you will be getting an evaluation tomorrow by email. Please take just a second to fill that out. It is enormously helpful to SWR and to RCDC. It's very helpful with our programming. The other thing that you'll be getting in your email in the next day or two is a link to a survey called Just Research, Exploring Anti-Racist and Anti-Oppressive Research Practice Among Social Workers. And that'll be coming directly from SWR as well. So if you could take a few minutes and fill that out, that again would be very helpful to the programming that SWR does and the work that RCDC is doing. I need to thank our panelists, Dr. Jen Bellamy, Dr. Jack Munnell, and Dr. Alan Detloff. We're so grateful for your time and for sharing your expertise. On behalf of RCDC and the rest of the SWR organization, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.
Thank you so much again. Bye, folks.